who worked in high security or advanced scientific fields have disappeared or turned up dead in the last 11 months. They're very loosely connected because of the types of work they did, but have very little in common. This was brought to the president's attention on Wednesday, and he was asked about it yesterday.
Well, I hope it's random, but we're going to know in the next week and a half. I just left a meeting on that subject, so pretty serious stuff. Hopefully, I don't know, coincidence, if you whatever you want to call it, but some of them were very important people.
Former Pentagon analyst Bob McGinnis says it could be coincidence, but in his time in the military, he was trained to always keep an eye out for foreign agents looking to recruit spies.
I suppose if there's a link that we can find, to suggest either that it's random or that truly it's espionage, there's no question that, we're constantly probed.
He says it would be easy to throw this into the conspiracy theorist bin, but with the current research into unidentified anomalous phenomena, what used to be called UFOs, what is a conspiracy and what is possible or likely has expanded over the last few years. The expertise that all the missing have could be helpful in the field of UFO research, but that connection hasn't been made with all of them.
Is it possible? Yes, that they're either there's an actual effort to kill or remove, disappear people that have special knowledge, and that, of course, would be disconcerting, but not totally surprising.
I'm Steve Jordahl.
President Trump took to social media yesterday to criticize New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, accusing him of destroying New York. New York Republican Representative Claudia Tinney agrees.
The communist anti-energy, anti-growth policies that are just tax and spend, eventually you'll have no one's money left to spend, and that's what's happening.
For American Family News, I'm Rusty Pugh.
If we lose this cultural war, we're going to have a hedonistic, humanistic society.
Discover the story of the culture warrior Don Wildman and how he went head-to-head with Hollywood, Playboy, the homosexual agenda, and the Disney empire. The movement Don started paved the way for Christians to boldly stand for truth and righteousness in a hostile culture. Watch Culture Warrior today for free. Visit culturewarrior.movie.
Jenna Ellis in the morning on American Family Radio.
I love talking about the things of God because of truth and the biblical worldview. The U.S. Constitution obligates our government to preserve and protect the rights that our founders recognize come from God, our Creator, not our government. I believe that Scripture in the Bible is very clear that God is the one that raised up each of you, and God has allowed us to be brought here to this specific moment in time.
This is Jenna Ellis in the morning.
Good morning. It is Friday, April 17th, and the Supreme Court has made a lot of headlines this year, as they do every year, because of some major cases that are coming before them and some opinions that they will need to render. And given the composition on the bench with, generally speaking, Justices Alito and Thomas being the most solid, predictably solid conservatives on the bench. Then you have, a couple of good justices that are overall generally in the right category, which I would include Gorsuch and Kavanaugh in there. Then you have the really kind of wildly unpredictable of Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett. And then you have the left wing, of course, of the remainder of Kagan, Sotomayor, and then the just extremely outlandish, always terribly predictable, actually, of, I think, the worst justice on the bench, which is Justice Jackson. You have, this really interesting spread. And so because Alito and Thomas are the most reliably consistent, stalwart conservatives that are originalists, they interpret the U.S. Constitution. They don't put their political bias on there. They actually are reliably good justices. The question has become, they are getting more senior in years. And so should Trump replace them and, call for their resignation? People from, all sides of the political spectrum, including even Matt Walsh in Daily Wire, posted a couple of weeks ago that he thinks that Alito and Thomas should retire. But it's basically been just sort of a hypothetical that conservatives have been pondering before the 2028 presidential election, so that we don't have basically what we had in 2016, which was a major election issue because of the death of Justice Scalia. And really, who was going to replace him was a major voting issue. And of course, if Democrats gain control of the White House in 2028, and then after that, Alito and Thomas either retire or pass away, as it's possible, then a Democrat would be able to appoint, and that would change, of course, the composition of the bench. And so President Trump, though, actually leaned into this issue just yesterday morning on possibly replacing Justices Alito and Thomas. And there have been more and more speculation and rumblings that Justice Alito may be looking at retirement after this session in 2026 ends. So it's become a little bit more than just academic. So this coming from CNN, President Trump seems to be leaning in on the idea that elderly conservative justices Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas might think about a conveniently timed retirement this year. Trump couched his comments to Fox Business's Maria Bartiromo in respect for the jurisprudence and decision-making of both justices, but he also repeatedly gestured at the political utility of retiring them soon, which obviously can't be ignored. I mean, that's just the reality of this. And so Trump said of Alito, I think he's one of the great justices of all time. It'd be nice to say, now I have somebody for 40 years. So Trump said he already has a short list of possible replacements and alluded to how justices can preserve their ideology on the court for decades to come by allowing for like-minded replacements. So where do we go from here? Well, let's welcome in Mike Donnelly, who is a constitutional law professor. He's an attorney as well. He's been a law professor at Patrick Henry College, and he's done a lot for Regent as well. And is a great advocate for conservative justices as well on the Supreme Court. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining. And my first question on this, though, just the practical reality of the Senate, which would have to provide their consent, not just their advice. They would have to affirm a nominee of President Trump. Are we at a point right now in 2026 that we could even get a confirmation from the U.S. Senate of a like-minded Alito or Thomas-like justice, even if all things happened and President Trump was able to nominate someone?
Well, Jenna, as always, great to be with you. And just to clarify, I'm not currently teaching constitutional law, but I did for a long, long time, and I pay attention.
Yes, you do.
But I appreciate that. I have to start with first things first. We'll come back to your question, but I just have to remind everybody that, you said something in your monologue opening there about SCOTUS making headlines as it always does, and how SCOTUS picks are a major election issue. And I just want to go on the record and say, I hate that. The constitutional founders never intended for the court to make headlines and to be a major election issue, I don't think.
I agree.
And what you're saying is that the federal government has become so important, so powerful that this is what we hang on every day, what the Supreme Court's going to say about this or about that. Article 3 of the Constitution says the court is there to decide cases and controversies, not to strike down state laws, not to strike down the laws that Congress passes, not to be a fixture in our lives telling us what we think about this or whether, men can marry men or boys can be in girls' sports, right? We're supposed to be governing ourselves. That's how a republic works. We're not supposed to be governed by 9 people sitting in Washington, D.C. So I just got to get that out there for the record. Okay.
Yes, and I know that getting that off your chest, we have. I fully agree with that, and I so wish that we did not have to focus on the Supreme Court and their opinions and basically the oligarchy that they have become and the nine-robed tyrants that the founders never intended. So here we are. We can talk about solutions to that, of course, and we have extensively on this program. But while we're in the current system that we are, unfortunately, the U.S. Senate, I mean, can we confirm?
Yeah. Well, I think so. It is a political question, right? So one key question are the Republicans going to even keep the Senate? That's something that some people are talking about. I personally think it's very likely, but it's not 100%. It's possible that they could lose it. If they do, you can kiss, confirming any conservative goodbye until the Senate goes back to the Republicans' hands. Or do they lose a seat or two? And does that now mean that it's even harder to confirm somebody who's a true conservative? Chuck Grassley, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, floated very recently Mike Lee and Ted Cruz as names who he would like to suggest as being put on the court. The Senate hasn't. The Senate has not lost a senator to the Supreme Court in a really long time. The last time was back in the 40s. 3 senators were appointed by FDR during the 30s and 40s, I think. Hasn't happened in a really long time. I think Mike Lee would be a fantastic Supreme Court justice. I have a hard time imagining Ted Cruz sitting and listening as much as justices have to do, but he would be brilliant as well. Could they get confirmed? Well, the Senate, would the Senate deny one of their own? I don't know. We live in a new era, but I would think that if Mike Lee were appointed, he would get a very favorable hearing and he could get confirmed. Trump's short list, I'm not sure what his short list is. There are a number of names that have been talked about. You've got Andrew Oldham, who's the Fifth Circuit judge. He's 47 years old. Naomi Rao, who's on the D.C. Circuit. She's 52. She's an Indian American. You got James Poe, Southeast Asian. He's on the Fifth Circuit. He's 52. Amal Tapar has been talked about. He's kind of institutionalist. So I don't know what other names he's got on his list. These are people that have been talked about. But, should Justice Alito and Justice Thomas retire? I don't think so. They're excellent. If they want to retire, I would say, okay, they should be able to decide what they want to do with their lives, but these are 2 of the best justices on the court. I would hate to see them go.
I would too, and I think that the only reason to have them go is to get someone in that same model for the next, hopefully about 40 years, because, the unfortunate reality is that Justice Thomas will not live forever. I wish that he would, just to be able to be on the bench for so long. But, they are getting advanced. And we saw what happened with the Democrats, where Ginsburg waited and didn't retire and then was sort of probably trying to wait out Trump and then ultimately passed away in office. And Trump got to replace that seat. And so that's, I think, the vein of where conservatives are questioning the wisdom of retiring, but not just the composition of the Senate after the midterm elections. The question about whether a justice would get confirmed now. The talk is that if Alito retires this June, then Trump would want to replace that seat before the November election. And so that's kind of the timeline that at least it appears a lot of people are floating. And so with the current composition of the Senate, where, yes, Republicans have a very, very, very slight majority, but, we do have the nuclear option, at least as it relates to the justices. And so Vice President J.D. Vance could cast a tie-breaking vote. So we only need the 51. Is that possible for such a conservative like Alito or Thomas? And I think you're right that it depends on who that conservative is. if it's someone like a Mike Lee, who I think would be in that same vein, I think he'd be fantastic. That would probably be an easier sell to the Senate, who it's a colleague of theirs, versus someone else who's been floated, like perhaps a Kristen Waggoner, who has been the CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom for the last few years, just because she and her organization, have presided over the filings of lawsuits like 303 Creative, Masterpiece, a lot of these cases that have dealt with religious freedom. And so to the Senate, she may appear to be more of a Christian conservative ideologue than someone like a Mike Lee that they may find more palpable. So it probably does depend on the identity of the nominee. It always does, but just even it's somebody who we would consider, okay, these are all in the same vein. They're equally, green listed as far as we're concerned. The Senate might look at them a little differently. So how do you think if Alito, for example, retires in June, Trump nominates someone right away, and the goal is to get them seated before the November election, who do you see as, besides, Mike Lee or Ted Cruz, who else would you see as maybe being able to get past the Senate in that type of scenario?
Well, it would have to be somebody who's currently a sitting judge, I would think. You're not going to get someone like Kristen Waggoner, who clerked at the Supreme Court and has done really great work. But I think, some of the moderate Republicans would have a lot of ammunition to be like, what, this person's never been a judge, and they don't have a track record, and it would take a lot longer to meet a timeline that you just laid out. Which, Justice Alito, he's 76, going on 77, I think. He's younger than Justice Thomas, who is 77. Actually, Alito's 75. He'll be 76. Thomas is 77. By the way, Justice Thomas has said he's going to serve until 2034. So I don't see him retiring unless something serious happens. And Justice Alito's in pretty good health, although he recently was hospitalized. So, they're talking about it. He's got a book coming out in October. So there is this talk about him retiring. I think that in terms of people, you need a judge from an appeals court. Some of the names that I mentioned before, maybe a Supreme Court judge from a state, potentially. I haven't really thought about any of those, but there are a number of states where he could pull from. People like Clint Bullock down in Arizona, or, maybe somebody from Alabama. But again, you need somebody who's got some track record to get quickly through the Senate. I don't think anybody could get more quickly through the Senate than Mike Lee, and I think Mike Lee would be just phenomenal. He would carry on. He clerked for Alito twice. So, you'd be replacing Alito with an Alito clerk and somebody we know very well. So that, to me, that seems like a great idea.
Yeah, and there are a few others that have been at least on the AFA Action green list, and I'm hopeful to have Philip Juregi, who is our Center for Judicial Renewal Senior Counsel, on next week to talk about this more. But the green list currently that has been provided with all of the research supporting that, and by the way, you can find that at afaaction.net/CJR for Center for Judicial Renewal. And then there's a link there for Supreme Court prospects. And, one of the interesting ones that's on the green list there are a couple of judges, including Kyle Duncan, James Ho. John Sauer is actually on the list, who, currently serves in the DOJ, and also Andrew Bailey, who I think would be a phenomenal choice, even though he hasn't been a judge. Of course, was the Attorney General for Missouri, and now is the Deputy Director over at the FBI. And I think just his view of jurisprudence would be amazing. But to your point, do you think that even though, the left has confirmed people like Justice Kagan, who, was never a judge before she went onto the Supreme Court, but was confirmed anyway. I mean, we're in a little bit different of a posture here, but do you think that somebody as phenomenal as an Andrew Bailey would have a difficult time with confirmation?
I feel like I'm looking at the list here. These are great names you've got on this afaaction.net Supreme Court prospects. And I also see that you've put some reds on some of the judges, and I think those are appropriate. Naomi Rao, Bumate, Thapar, Walker. I do. I think, this is a question of what's John Thune going to do. Is John going to buck the president? I don't think he's going to on this. I think, there is a role for the Senate. It's called advice and consent. That's what the Constitution gives it. It's not a veto. although, it's kind of wielded that way a little bit. But, if John Thune says, look, we're going to get behind the president on this, I think he can get the senators behind him. It may take a little while, but I think it can be done. And these are all fantastic names. I mean, Andrew Bailey, Kyle Duncan, James Ho, John Sauer is fantastic as a Solicitor General. Of course, I listened to the birthright citizenship case that we talked about recently, and I thought he did an exceptional job there. I think John knows the Constitution in and out. He's litigated it. He would be a great justice. You've got Lawrence Van Dyke on here. I see Kristen Wagner's on here, too. Although Kristen, I think, would be a really hard to get through. Even John Sauer, too, would be hard. Yeah. I think, if you want something quick, you've got to get somebody who's been a judge, who's got a track record that the Senate can look at and get behind.
Yeah. Well, and and this is pure speculation because I don't know the answer to this, but in terms of what you've heard in D.C. or kind of what others in our network of lawyers and so forth maybe have been speculating, Trump clearly is a little disenchanted with Leonard Leo, who of the Federalist Society, who he really took all of that suggestion. Leonard Leo was basically the point person, for those who don't know, in Trump's first term for the nominees that ultimately were selected. And there could have been better ones. I was not a fan of Kavanaugh. I do think, and I wrote at the time and appeared prolifically on that topic on media before I worked for President Trump about Kavanaugh. I'm glad to see that once Trump nominated him, he didn't withdraw that support based on just accusations that literally had no proof. It was just a way to try to get to Kavanaugh and, me to him. So I'm glad that he maintained that support. But overall, he wasn't my first pick, right? So Leonard Leo had a lot to say, and Trump went in 2016 saying, I have a list, I'm going to stick to that list, and these are people that you guys, meaning the conservative movement as a whole, are behind, and I'm going to give you what you want. And he really did deliver on that, whether or not they were our top choices. I think a lot of people, even including Phil Duraghi, would say that as much as he initially loved Amy Coney Barrett, she's been kind of a disappointment. But overall, who, Mike, do you think that President Trump is listening to now that we don't have as much of a Federalist Society influence? So he says that he has a list, but is this, my best guess is, okay, probably, Stephen Miller, America First Legal, he's probably, talking to everybody that, he calls, but actually putting the names on the list, are you aware of anyone else besides those who are already in the White House, like, Stephen Miller, Ed Martin, who's the pardons attorney. I know he still talks to Cleta Mitchell frequently. There are a few people I know he would consult, but are you aware of kind of a point person for how he created this list?
I'm not, Jenna. I don't have any of that kind of inside information. And so I'm sure he has people like you're talking about now who he's listening to. Donald Trump learned a lot between term one and term two, and then we see that by what he's doing and how he's doing it. And I think he's holding some of these cards closer right now. And, look, the man is a consummate negotiator, and he knows it's going to be a negotiation. When we go back to, looking at how things have happened, he could float a name for one reason and then pull that back. That's what happened with George Bush. Remember Harriet Miers? And then we ended up getting Alito, right? And that was great, turning out to be one of the best justices we've had on the Supreme Court, who we got, who wrote the Dobbs decision. So, Donald Trump knows what he's doing, I believe. He's listening to a variety of voices and getting input. And I hope he's listening to AFA Action. And I worked with Phil for a number of years on some of his work when he was vetting Supreme Court justices. And I'm so glad that AFA is doing this work. I hope that the people who Donald Trump is listening to are listening to you guys. The Federalist Society is a great organization, has done really important work, in the conservative movement, helping advance originalism and other things. So I think we have to recognize that that's a voice that maybe Donald Trump isn't listening to as much, maybe, but there are a lot of voices out there, and I hope he's listening to a variety of people, including the ones that you've talked about.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, and that's really the main thrust of AFA Action is to Green light studies have extensive research, and also red list as well. The ones that shouldn't be selected, that I really don't think that Trump has any intention of selecting. Anyone who is, remotely leftist has, for example, we know that Judge Boasberg isn't going to be on his list, right? I mean, there's a few people I think we can rule out, but who exactly he's listening to. And also, I think when he decides to release the list is going to be very interesting. And my suspicion is, and I could be wrong because Trump does, all kinds of unpredictable things, but my suspicion is he's not going to release that until there's a retirement announcement. And then he'll go ahead and say, okay, here's the few people I'm considering. And then maybe float a few names, or even have, some of his allies and influencers and associates kind of float some names to see the public perception, to kind of see where the Senate is. And, as you said, overall, at the end of the day, it is a negotiation. And that's how he approached the Supreme Court in the first term. I mean, he wanted the evangelical base to support him when initially they didn't. And he basically guaranteed that, here's the list and I will select from this list. And he delivered. And he delivered for the base. I think, honestly, unfortunately, he delivered more on his promises than the evangelical base delivered on theirs, which is part of the reason that he didn't see the evangelical base as much necessary in 2024, unfortunately, in terms of standing up for certain things like traditional marriage, biblical marriage, some of those things. But to him, all of this is a negotiation. How exactly this works itself out, we'll see. But it's very possible that we could see another Supreme Court justice for Donald Trump, and then it will be 4 out of the 9, which is amazing. But we've got to go to break here. Mike Donnelly is sticking with us for some more headlines when we come right back here on Jenna Ellis in the Morning.
The following is a real-life story from Trinity Debt Management.
I had a lot of credit card debt, and it stressed me out. But what I thought was a solution turned out to be a problem. I kept hearing ads about debt settlement that seemed too good to be true. And actually, it was. When I called, they told me to stop paying my bills. That didn't sound right to me at all, so I hung up. Later, I found out that debt settlement is bad. Real bad. Then I learned that there is a right way to pay off your credit cards. It's called a debt management program from the great team at Trinity. Trinity had a plan. In the end, I paid off my bills, I saved thousands, and I even improved my credit score.
If credit card debt has you down, call Trinity at 1-800-788-1813.
My name is Heather. Please forget debt settlement and remember Trinity Debt Management.
1-800-788-1813.
Candace talks about finding out she was pregnant. Thankfully, an ultrasound provided by Preborn allowed her to hear her baby's heartbeat.
The sonogram sealed the deal for me. My baby was like this tiny little spectrum of hope. And I saw his heart beating on the screen. And knowing that there's life growing inside, that sonogram changed my life. I went from just Candace to mom. Thank you to everybody that has given these gifts. You guys are giving more than money. You guys are giving love.
Preborn currently has clinics that do not have ultrasound machines. Would you consider a leadership gift and sponsor a machine today? These life-saving machines cost $15,000, more than most centers can afford. Your donation will save countless lives for years to come. Dial pound 250 and say the keyword baby, or go to preborn.com/AFR.
Hello, Americans. I'm Todd Starnes. Stand by for news and commentary next. The nation's public education system has waged war against Christians for generations. First, they came after prayer. Then they expelled the baby Jesus from Christian pageants. Even the Gideons, Christian businessmen giving children free Bibles, they were banished too. Now we're beginning to understand why the left wanted to remove God. They wanted to make room for Muhammad. In Tennessee, 2 schools in the Nashville area are in the headlines for embracing the Islamic faith. Overton High School, for example, completely changed its schedule to accommodate Muslim kids for Ramadan. Teachers decorated classrooms, gave kids prayer rugs, even allowed them to leave class early to pray. And at Valor Collegiate Academies, they installed special bells to announce times for Muslim prayers. The school said they want to be a place where Muslim students can feel welcome. But what about the Christian kids? You know, it sounds to me as if there is a deliberate movement in the Bible Belt to marginalize people of faith. I'm Todd Stearns.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back, and I'm still here with my special guest this morning, Mike Donnelly, who's an attorney and originalist, and someone that you really need to follow on X at Donnelly Speaks for his wit, his perspectives, and occasional snark, which is something that we always appreciate about him. So Mike, the other topic that's not so much in the news right now, but something that overall I think that we need to consider moving forward, especially as there are governor's races that are a very big deal coming up this November as well. It's not just the composition of Congress for the midterms that everybody kind of focuses on. There are a lot of governorships that are open for this election, especially including who will replace Ron DeSantis in my home state of Florida. And I really, really wish that we could just extend that into perpetuity and, he could just become the king of Florida. I'd be okay with that one exception to the Constitution for Ron DeSantis. That's it. But unfortunately, he's term limited. He loves term limits. We do too. I'm mostly kidding. But that's going to be a very big deal. And so in the context of governors, we saw not that long ago, I mean, it's been 6 years, but really not that long, since 2020, and the utter abuse of executive emergency powers that basically were just delegated completely. The legislative power was delegated to the executive to have emergency powers kind of extend into perpetuity for as long as the executive deemed it necessary. And so after 2020 and the whole, COVID disaster and kind of, public trial, I think, of how much we were all willing to put up with our rights and liberties being trampled, there was a call for legislative changes to emergency powers. And that really isn't in the news much anymore. And so where are we at in terms of emergency powers and ensuring that something like COVID and some kind of public health crisis, quote unquote, can't infringe upon our liberties moving forward?
Jenna, I'm so glad you're talking about this. This is a really important question. And, it's 6 years, but we all remember like it was just yesterday when the federal government led the way and then the states just followed suit. And what an insane response that we had to live through for, 2 or 3 years, and the impact that it had on so many people negatively, on kids, closing down all the schools. Of course, as homeschoolers, we continued on, and the schools tried to do Zoom school, but didn't work out very well. The damage that was done by the way that was handled was just indescribable and hard to quantify. We're just still dealing with the effects of it. But there's some good news coming out of that, right? A lot of states did realize that their emergency powers laws allowed governors way too much leeway. And so a number of states took action in the 22, 23, 24 timeframe to limit governors' abilities to declare emergencies, limited the circumstances, and also limited the duration. My own state of West Virginia, we had Jim Justice, who was elected as a Democrat in 2016, then became a quote-unquote Republican. Not really. Now he's our U.S. Senator. And he used emergency powers, and he basically followed what Mike DeWine was doing in Ohio, which wasn't very good. So he was just a little Mike DeWine. Everything Ohio did, West Virginia did. And it wasn't the worst. It wasn't like New York or Michigan, but it wasn't Florida. And that's what we wanted in West Virginia. We wanted what Florida was doing. We wanted what Ron DeSantis was doing, which was, hey, we can make these decisions for ourselves. It's not government's role to tell people how to do this, let people make their decisions. And unlike the federal government also that was trying to put the thumb on all of us and put their boot on our throat, and also, by the way, interfering with Facebook and all of the things that came out of that was horrible. But, states have passed a lot of legislation, so that's a good thing. There are still some states that are dealing with this, and some states went in the wrong direction, actually, like California, shocker. So I think we learned some things out of it, but there's still more to learn. And I just want to say one thing about governors. You're right. You said governors are important, and they really are. Going back to my point earlier in the conversation about federalism, if we're going to reassert true federalism and reduce the size and scope and power of the federal government, it's going to come from the states. It's going to come from governors like Ron DeSantis leading and showing the example. And I want to point out two people who are actually leaving the U.S. Senate. You'd think nobody would ever leave the U.S. Senate, but you've got two senators, Marsha Blackburn and Tommy Tuberville, who are leaving the U.S. Senate to go back to their states to run for and almost certainly win as governors. So I find that encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking of emergency powers and all of this, as you were saying, how much we had to endure as a nation, and, some states obviously more than others, mainly, the contrast between California, New York versus Florida. A lot of that, unfortunately, yet again, came down to a Supreme Court decision, right? If the Supreme Court had not ruled the way that it did in the OSHA mandate case and the Biden case, I think that the COVID narrative would have continued for as long, really until Trump took office again. I think that the Biden administration was planning on continuing that to try to infringe upon our freedoms and liberties for as long as they could get away with it. And it's unfortunate that it had to come down to a Supreme Court opinion, to our point earlier in the show that all of these things really shouldn't come down to that. But part of the reason that the executive emergency powers were so important to reconsider and legislate on the state level is that we saw during COVID, there were so many states that had basically just ceded to the governors to be able to exercise emergency authority over and above anything that the legislature did, even without legislative consent, they could just continue to extend their own emergency powers into perpetuity for as long as the executive deemed fit. And so that really goes against the non-delegation clause of the U.S. Constitution, because emergency powers are supposed to be just for what they actually purport to be, an emergency, a very limited, concrete, clearly defined time period to deal with an emergency. Then, if states want to legislate accordingly, it can go before the full body, and there can be the deliberative process with the constituents' input. And that didn't happen during COVID. And that was the main problem, was that then there was so much power that the founders never intended in state governors, and they basically became petty tyrants of their own states. And so with the states that have legislated accordingly after 2020 and the whole COVID narrative, what have they changed about emergency powers?
Well, that's exactly what they have changed, Jenna. The core changes have been to not allow this extension ad infinitum at the governor's discretion. They basically said, no, you have 30 days or 60 days, and then the legislature must act. The governor cannot extend it on his own. The legislatures have to vote to extend it and then legislate accordingly. So that's exactly what they've changed. All those states that have made changes, those are the primary changes that they've made. But, you talk about emergencies going on forever. This is a problem at the federal government level as well. There are states of emergencies that have been going on for decades, like Jimmy Carter's Iran emergency declaration, which, by the way, maybe it needed to go on for decades because, Iran declared war on us back in 1979, and we never declared war on them until recently, and we didn't even declare war. Donald Trump is just doing what he has decided needs to be done in the best interest of the United States. Okay, fine. But the point being that there are a lot of other emergencies, and what that does is it gives the president just all kinds of authority to spend money and to do things. Mm-hmm. And again, that's really not what these emergency powers are supposed to be for. They're supposed to be limited in duration for particular things, and it's been abused by all of the presidents, and Congress has made some efforts to change that. There have been some bills introduced, but they just haven't been able to get it through. And, of course, then you've got to get it past the president, and what president wants his power to be curtailed, even Trump, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I'm not sure if we're going to see significant reform even at the federal level.
Yeah. Yeah, and, it's so amazing to me that as much as this current Congress, even including some Republicans, genuinely just hate Trump regardless of what he's doing. It's surprising to me that Congress, even under that theory, and we can disagree with that, but then wouldn't do the right thing by curtailing overall presidential power that we would agree with, even if the motivation was wrong. It's actually surprising to me that Congress isn't reining in the federal government's power by their own constitutional prerogative. I mean, the Congress and even the members of Congress are looking to the Supreme Court to do it, which is the totally wrong thing. It's like they don't even recognize their own power under the Constitution.
No, they don't want to exercise it because they don't want to be held accountable. They want other people to be accountable so they don't have to be. And this is the problem we've been dealing with for 75 years, ever since Congress started to delegate its authority to the to the executive branch. It started doing that in the 30s, 40s under FDR, Truman, and Congress was like, we can just pass a law, tell the executive branch to write rules, and then we don't have to do anything. This is great. And nobody can blame us because we can just say, well, don't blame us, blame the executive. And that's what's happening. And so the incentive is for Congress to do that because they don't want to do the work. And frankly, again, going back to the whole problem, the federal government is too big for one body to manage. It's just too big. You need an executive branch, a powerful one, to administer a entity as big as the federal government. You want it to be efficient. You want it to be able to do things if you want it to do things, which I don't want it to do things. But if you're going to have it do things and take all that money and spend it all, it's got to, it's just naturally going to have that level of power. And try to take power back from a bureaucracy like that. Not easy to do because it has money, it has interests. The incentives in Congress are not to be held accountable. They don't want to be held accountable. They want to point the finger at somebody else. So that's fundamentally part of the problem we have to grapple with as a country is all articles in the Constitution are not operating the way they were intended to operate. And I'll point it back to yesterday was tax day, April 15th. Everybody paid their taxes, and we benefited from the One Big Beautiful Bill. My taxes were better. I think a lot of other people's were as well, so that's great. But what does that mean? All that money is still going to the federal government, and that's why we have a federal government that's out of control, because it can stick its hands in our pockets anytime it wants to and just take money out. And the founders never intended that. They did not give the federal government the direct taxing power for that reason. Okay, and it wasn't until the 16th Amendment in 1913 that was passed that gave them that authority. And now what do we have? We have the monster that we have right now. So if we want to do something about it, we've got to deal with cutting off the oxygen to the fire, stopping the bleeding, whatever analogy you want to use, and that means getting rid of the income tax. In my opinion, that's the one thing we could do to really make some reform that would affect the size and scope of the federal government. I mean, look, Trump has done a lot of good things. This federal government is smaller than it's ever been. The One Big Beautiful Bill has made some changes, but if we're going to really fundamentally reform how the power the federal government has, we got to deal with that.
Yeah, 100%. And that's really the biggest breakdown of the federal government is the legislative branch and Congress not actually doing their job. And I think it's absolutely spot on that they don't want accountability. They just want to be performative in front of the cameras. They just want to have their little intramural spats, and they want fame and power and, stock trading and all of these other things. And, on the Republican side, the Mar-a-Lago invites, and on the Democrat side, just to be able to be obstructionists for Trump, and they don't actually want to get anything done on either side. So we've got to take a break here, but Mike Donnelly, really appreciate it as always. And again, follow him on X at Donnelly Speaks. And speaking of another thing that Congress should be doing that they're not, we mentioned earlier in the program about the Supreme Court deciding birthright citizenship. Well, that should be Congress's job. And so even though, we can debate about how the Supreme Court should opine and decide that case, it really shouldn't have come before them to begin with. This needs to be Congress legislating according to their vested authority from Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution that gives them the subject matter of establishing a uniform rule of immigration naturalization. They can decide birthright citizenship. So I wrote a piece that you need to read this week in the Daily Caller. The title is Jenna Ellis, Congress should decide birthright citizenship, not the Supreme Court. All right, we will be right back with more.
Good article.
Thank you.
While we rejoice that Roe was overturned, the pro-choicers are very energized. They are winning the arguments and elections. We need to win them back. The people who bring you Wretched Radio have produced a powerful, persuasive, and proactive 13-lesson video series to help.
You don't need a PhD to tell you that human life is more valuable than the life of the ants.
Order Life is Best at shop.wretched.org. And listen to Wretched Radio Saturday nights at 10 Central on American Family Radio. Weekday mornings at 8 Central, Pastor Jeff Shreve offers real truth for today.
I'm the pastor of First Baptist Church in Texarkana, Texas, and the founder of From His Heart Ministries.
The world around us is rapidly changing, but God and His truth will never change.
I may be the host of the show, but I want God's Word and His truth to be the star of the show.
Join Pastor Jeff Shreve each weekday morning at 8 Central for Real Truth for Today on American Family Radio.
They're coming for your family, not with guns, not with armies, but with laws, with lawsuits, with ballots and bureaucrats. Parental rights are under attack. Marriage is being redefined. Your values, they want them silenced, and they're counting on you to do nothing. But here's the thing, we're not backing down. I'm Walker Wildman, and AFA Action is in the fight, in the legislature, in the courtroom, and at the ballot box. We're stopping bad legislation, we're challenging activist judges, and through iVoter Guide, we're helping Christians vote like it matters, because it does. Thousands of families are already standing with us, and I believe the American family is still worth fighting for, but we can't do it without you, and we need your help today. Visit afaaction.net right now. Give today. Join us on the front lines, because the other side isn't slowing down, and neither can we. afaaction.net. Your voice, your values, your vote.
What if healthcare could be more than bills and bureaucracy? What if it could reflect faith, foster community, and offer spiritual support? At Redeem Health Share Ministry, the mission goes beyond medical bills. It's about honoring Christ and embracing healthcare that aligns with Christian values. Redeem members share medical expenses through monthly contributions, supporting one another in a Christ-centered community. It's not insurance, it's believers helping believers through financial support and prayer. And Redeem Health Share provides freedom for members to select the doctors, hospitals, and treatments that are right for them. No networks, no restrictions, just faith-driven care. From everyday checkups to unexpected medical emergencies, Redeem offers flexible programs and encouragement rooted in Scripture. Because your health care should reflect your faith, not compromise it. More at redeemhealthshare.org or call 1-844-REDEEM-0.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back. Well, speaking of things that Congress really needs to fix, and they're not, is higher standards across Congress, regardless of party. And this call was from Congressman Marlin Stutzman from the great state of Indiana. And, it's so true. And we've been talking about the lack of moral standards across Congress throughout this week with the resignation of both Eric Swalwell and then also the Republican Gonzalez, and looking at the uniform assessment of both parties that, yes, their actions warrant resignation from Congress, but shouldn't that then motivate and warrant Congress actually imposing some standards for themselves and perhaps creating a standard to say, if you don't abide by this in your personal life, then you are subject to expulsion, because under the U.S. Constitution, that prerogative is given to the House that they can, and at the Senate as well, that they can expel their own members. And so let's welcome in Congressman Stutzman. And, I think that expulsion for lack of good behavior, for example, which is the same thing that justices and federal judges can be impeached for, that's something that really does need to change in Congress.
Yeah, Jenna, I would agree. I mean, we need to hold ourselves accountable. We also need to hold ourselves to a higher standard. The one thing about whenever the Bible talks about leadership roles, that leadership is held to a higher standard. And Congress falls in that category, of course. And, whether it's a member of Congress, whether it's a pastor, whether it's a business owner, a CEO, or anybody in leadership, I mean, we have rules even in our office down to, anybody who's handling the internship program, that there has to be guidelines and restrictions on any sort of relationships, because we don't want somebody in authority taking advantage of their position of authority over someone else. And so this is it seems like common sense, basic morality. But I'll tell you, I've known Eric Swalwell for a long time. I didn't know Tony Gonzalez as much, but Eric Swalwell has always been kind of greasy to me and also very arrogant. And so, I guess I'm really not surprised. Of course, very disappointed, especially with the rape accusations. But every member of Congress, whether Republican or Democrat, we need to be held to high standards. And ultimately, I know the American people, our voters, will. But I think as soon as these cases come up and there is evidence, especially if there's criminal evidence, then Congress needs to take a serious look and act quickly.
Yeah, and a lot of this has really boiled down to more political convenience. And I was talking yesterday with one of my pastors, actually, about with how the standard of morality seems to just be a political convenience for Congress, and it really shouldn't be that way. And so is there discussion among the leadership? I mean, at least like Speaker Johnson, for example, who himself is, a very devout Christian. He has a high moral ethic for himself and his family, which I deeply respect. And, proposing some kind of code of conduct or, something that governs this Congress. I mean, obviously that could be changed in future Congresses, but to at least maybe establish that kind of protocol.
Yeah, no, and you know what, Jenna, I would actually argue, because I've been, in Congress from 2010 to 17, then I was in the private sector from 2018 to 2024, now back in Congress, that there is, with all of the camera phones, with all of the, politics is it's the art of taking the other person, down a notch if possible. People are trying to climb up, and whenever they can, find somebody doing something inappropriate or unethical, it's reported generally. And, but I see when I was in the private sector, even businessmen that I worked with that were living inappropriate lives that, no one was holding them accountable in a newspaper or on TV or on a radio station or on the floor of Congress. And so I do believe that, we as members of Congress need to hold one another accountable. And we have to, we're a representative of the United States society and as a whole to the rest of the world and also to our country, of course. And so, whenever we have an ethics committee that these cases go to immediately if there's question, and the ethics committee works through those, and oftentimes it's done quietly because we do want to make sure that if there is innocence, that is protected. But at the same time, when there is strong evidence and, of course, criminal activity or criminal investigation, then there's more room to act as a whole body in Congress.
Yeah, absolutely. And and there is definitely a place for due process, even within the context of expulsion or or process that Congress may determine through the ethics committee and so forth, because we've also seen the political calculation on the other side where false accusations can damage or end a person's political career, and that is totally unwarranted. So absolutely there needs to be a balance. But it seems like there are fewer of the false accusations when it comes to some of this stuff that, like in Swalwell's case, I mean, there were journalists that were on X basically saying they've known that for the last 13 years. And it's like, well, great. Why didn't you report it until it came out now? I mean, because it seems so politically convenient. So where do you see that balance then being struck between accusations that are false? And we've seen those, hurled at President Trump, for example, like, oh, he's a racist. Oh, he's, this, that, and the other, that clearly has no grounding in fact, that the left is trying to use simply to damage him politically, versus holding members of Congress and also presidents and, everybody in public office actually accountable for the deeds that they do, not just in office, but also their personal life, because that does matter, having a moral and upright character.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to all of us as individuals, whether we, if we know something is wrong, if somebody, whether you follow the Matthew 18 model, and maybe you don't know that person in that close enough of a sense, but if you have that ability to approach them one-on-one, if they refuse to hear you and you feel like the evidence is strong, then you need to go with two people. And you would, of course, go to leadership. I mean, I've run into cases myself with other members that I knew were doing something inappropriate. And so I went straight to the leadership of the caucus and said, I think we have a problem. And then, of course, and many times the Speaker of the House, they're not allowing these things, and oftentimes they take care of them personally. In the case of Tony Gonzalez, I was one of the first members to call for him to not run for re-election, and he did decide not to run for re-election. The case with him, the girl that he was having an affair committed suicide. I don't know for sure if there's a criminal investigation going on. I know there is an ethics investigation with him, and I think he made the right choice by stepping down. But of course, in the case of Eric Swalwell, this young lady and the other ladies that are stepping forward and announcing what happened to them, that's very brave. And I think it's a difference. There's a double standard oftentimes on the left and the right. But if somebody steps up on the right making an accusation towards anyone on the left, or if they would know something, they're just immediately beat down. But in this case, it was just so strong and evident. And, people say, well, why did she do it now? I tell you, that's a hard thing to do, especially for a young lady in that situation that doesn't have the same platform or the same, here, Eric Swalwell's running for governor of California. He's got a huge platform and has the ability to speak loudly. So I think that's, difficult for each person to make that decision themselves. But, boy, when they step forward and do what's right, I think that's always rewarded.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so well said, and I hope that Speaker Johnson and maybe Leader Thune can, get together and maybe have just a standard basic code of conduct that hopefully members of Congress shouldn't have any problem living up to. But I really appreciate you always having the biblical worldview and the moral position for even things, like a code of conduct in Congress. So thank you so much, and listeners can follow Representative Marlin Stutzman at Rep. Stutzman across platforms. And as always, you can reach me and my team, Jenna at afr.net.
The views and opinions expressed in this broadcast may not necessarily